Suicide Note by Mitchell Heisman. This work is a computer-generated reading of Suicide Note by Mitchell Heisman. This work is free and licensed by Mitchell Heisman for copying and distribution under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivative Works 3.0 United States license. Monkey wrench in the gene machine. Meet the individual. Modern political philosophy begins with a great discovery. The discovery of the individual. Modern man was conceived as an isolated island, a Robinson Crusoe, unique and absolute unto himself. From this modern finding comes the further discovery of individual rights. You secure these rights. America's Declaration of Independence explains, governments are instituted among men. The welfare of the individual was to be the measure of the modern good. A universal proposition presumed applicable to all men. Human rights, then, implied that the state exists for this abstraction called the individual, not for an individual, as in a dictatorship, but for the individual, as in the masses. If individuals should not be classified by their ethnic origins, then this abstraction of the individual itself should clearly not be classified by its ethnic origins. For then the game is truly up. Yet these liberal abstractions obscure the ethnicity of individualism, the original ethnic political context of these ideas in the English-speaking world. There should really be a line in the American national anthem where everyone sings together, in perfect unison, their belief in each American's unique individuality as a consequence of the success of the American flag's cause. The dominant social philosophy of the West is individualism. The liberal social ethic is to recognize the individuality of others and not infringe upon another's individual autonomy. To conform is simply to love yourself enough to realize that it is in your self-interest to at least pay lip service to the notion of love of humanity. It turns out that morality, in the liberal view, is universal egoism. If one individual's selfishness were achieved at the expense of another's selfishness, that would be immoral. Each individual's egoism must be total. The solution to the conflict of egoistic totalitarianisms is the equality of all egoisms. This means that world liberalism aspires to universal egoism. The more universal the egoism, the greater the liberal morality achieved. The purpose of the universe, in liberal cosmology, is to secure everyone a bourgeois existence. Individual supremacism sets an apartheid between individuals so that the individual is accorded separate and superior status over group or racial supremacism. That some seem to hate racism in a xenophobic manner simply because it's different from individualism is not entirely surprising. There is a basic similarity of form in that individual supremacism mirrors race supremacism as its inverse or opposite. More specifically, it is in one's interest as an individual to be prejudiced against racism and to weaken one's own race because any social claims of duty and obligation to a larger kin-racial group are always in potential conflict with individual freedom. Without the relinquishment of racism and other form of groupism, modern Western peoples would not be able to fully justify the apartheids between individuals necessary for selfishness as individuals. The possibilities of individualism are realizable only at the expense of the possibilities of racialism, and vice versa. The individual premise and the kin-selective premise are not equal for, in their extreme implications, they lead to divergent and opposite paths. I include liberalism as a form of individualism since, despite its obvious social inclinations, its original reasoning is premised on individualism, and it usually justifies its democratic social sympathies on a utilitarian measure of individuals in aggregate. Tocqueville described America as an experiment in democracy. Americans are the guinea pigs in this experiment. To assess the Western experiment in democracy requires the foundation of a science of human nature. This means taking account of an evolutionary understanding of the human in order to measure the effects of the experiment with the system of individual rights. One would have to measure the genetic reproductive success of liberal democratic populations with those of non-liberal democratic populations. For example, immigration has been suggested as a solution to declining birth rates in the West. Yet the question of why Western birth rates are in decline to begin with is a question that most prefer to leave unanswered. Darwin is of utter relevance here, for immigration is really about evolution. As I will show, Both the declining birth rate among established liberal democratic populations and the very possibility of immigration are two interrelated implications of individualism. Who is this familiar stranger? The individual. To solve this mystery, the discovery of the individual must meet the discoveries of sociobiology. The conflict between individual rights and eugenics helps shed light on a more general conflict. The conflict between the individual and the selfish gene. Throughout nearly 4 billion years of evolutionary history, individual organisms evolved by being means of the end of the selfish gene. In other words, genes survive by propagating themselves and, from this point of view, individual organisms are only machines evolved to serve genetic reproductive selfishness. The biblical sanctification of individual life began the subversion of the selfish gene. By valuing all individuals as of infinite value in the image of God, these values implicitly attacked the selective mechanisms underlying biological evolution. In this way, biblical values both laid a foundation for the ending biological evolution and began to open a space for post-biological evolution. If reason itself cannot determine fundamental values, then the modern valuation of the individual must be traced to another source, and the biblical values, through the secularization process of the hypocrisy industry, was key. While biblical values laid the foundation for modern values, and especially individual rights, some values were selectively sustained only because they were evolutionarily random to begin with. The Bible is actually an evolutionary guide that points the way to the end of biological evolution without cogently displaying evidence, to put it kindly, that its authors or main characters understood everything about where they were going. Mass individualism, with a distinct moral valuation of those most likely to be victims of natural selection, was the most potent general valuation inherited from the Bible. The individualism that acts as a monkey wrench in the gene machine for the selfish genes of that individual also acts as super monkey wrench against the selective mechanisms of biological evolution. On the level of mass individualism, the evolutionary significance of modern individualism is thus twofold. Valuing individual life subverts the logic of the selfish genes and, in doing so, lays a foundation for the post-biological evolution that culminates in artificial intelligence, aka God. Chapter break on the inferiority of racism. Back to text. As a rule, I generally assume there are exceptions to the biologically based generalizations I make. Evolutionary history illustrates why. Lineages can diverge and adapt to very different environments so that exceptions evolve that contradict strict biological categories or classifications. Mammals, for example, do not lay eggs, but there are exceptions among the monotremes, i.e. the platypus. Not all dinosaurs are extinct. Birds are dinosaurs. Note the similar foot structure of a Tyrannosaurus rex and most birds. Not all existing birds fly. Penguins are birds. While assuming there are exceptions to the generalization that I make, there may be some exceptions to this rule where a generalization really does apply to every single example without exception. But, in general, most generalizations I have encountered possess exceptions, and some more than others. All generalizations are not created equal any more than individuals are. One generalization might be 68% accurate, another 83%. Generalizing about the various human races is considered audacious by conventional liberal opinion, with one exception. An exception is made if one is really audacious, outrageously audacious enough to go even beyond the various human races and generalize about an entire common human race. Then, everyone can rest easy. This brazen generalization called humanity has an equal in its audacious historical opponent Normanity. Normanity is the historic English belief in the superiority of those descended from the Norman conquerors of 1066.1285. From this perspective, the audacious generalization of humanity in the English-speaking world can be traced to an overgeneralization of Anglo-Saxon opposition to belief in Normanity. Imagine, hypothetically, that before the Battle of Hastings, while there was still a kind of Norman-Saxon equality in the undecidedness of fortune, Duke William proclaimed, "Let the best race win." Anglo-Saxon acceptance of the conquest order for so long implied their acceptance that the best race did win at Hastings. The American way of the letting, not the best race win, but the best individuals win, emerges not only from an Anglo-Saxon sense of having permanently lost that battle, but their inability to explain their acceptance of the verdict of Hastings. For so long, the consequences of the defeat at Hastings help explain why Anglo-Saxons appear to represent an exception to the rule of ethnic identity. The Anglo-Saxon race became associated with the Anglo-Saxon caste. This meant that for Anglo-Saxons, race became ethnocentrically associated with the limitations inherent in an inferior caste. This also helps explain why for Anglo-Saxons, liberalism became conservatism. A strict and extreme philosophy of racial biological conservation would leave them with the belief that they are a socially and politically inferior hereditary body and should preserve or conserve this condition. There was only one hope: to emphasize what can be changed through faith in the ability to change and learn anew. The theory of individualism proved to be the winning method of freedom through the fruits of its practice. Individualism freed them from the centuries-old captivity of their ethnicity. Individual self-esteem could overcome ethnic humiliation. Valuing the individual as an end became the means of solving the problem of their ethnic history. Hereditary characteristics cannot be changed insofar as they are actually hereditary. However, the value accorded to race or other genetically rooted characteristics can be changed through a self-fulfilling doctrine that devalues hereditary origins. The legacy of Anglo-Saxon racial inferiority was in a sense accepted yet transcended by reversing its importance. The value of Anglo-Saxon racial inferiority was devalued by making race itself inferior to the new and higher value of the individual. In America, the legacy of Anglo-Saxon racial inferiority was formally inverted into the inferiority of racism. Yet this also implies that individualism represents Anglo-Saxon acceptance of their defeat as a race. Chapter break. Race reinvented. Back to main text. "We have it in our power to begin the world over again," declared Thomas Paine. He and many other Americans believed they could start over from the bad beginning that was 1066. As if they were picking up where that ghastly near-millennial interim left off. From a broken, deracinated nation, the Anglo-Saxons reinvented themselves as rational individuals. They reinvented their race, and in the process, reinvented race itself through the invention of individualism. The United States Constitution was, in part, the Anglo-Saxon attempt to literally reconstitute themselves as a body politic. Now if the Anglo-Saxon had been able to fully transform themselves into a Spartan-like military society with deep sense of political duty, that would have been an astounding expression of possibilities of freedom. Far from being a new order, liberal democracy actually exposes how Anglo-Saxons were unable to fully overcome their adaptation to their place in the old order. Something was lost that could not be reinstated artificially through this degenerate regeneration through individualism. They internalized their identity as the opposite of a master race. The new constitution was also a formal funeral for themselves as socio-biological bodies. Their national disintegration was now formalized. They ceased to be bound to their Anglo-Saxon origins, and were now given a secular baptism as individuals. A consequence of the enlightened cleverness of individualism is that the liberal individualist often assumes the inferiority of individuals who emphasize race over the individual. But let us consider whether the inverse implication is accurate from a self-consistent racial point of view. Should races assume the historic inferiority of the race that emphasizes individual achievement over the race achievement? Is it the powerlessness of individuals that can catalyze racism as a means of empowerment, or is it the powerlessness of a race that can catalyze individualism as a means of empowerment? We do not have to choose, for both could be true in different circumstances. Anglo-Saxon individualism is a case where the powerlessness of their race under Norman subjugation catalyzed individualism as a means of empowerment. Anglo-Americans who associate Nazi racism with weakness are simply projecting Anglo-Saxon ethnocentrism onto the Germans. If we are not conformists to universal mass individualism, then we can entertain the following generalization: German culture was more accepting the legitimacy of racist generalizations, while Anglo-Saxon and especially American norms, tended to be more resistant to such generalizations. World War II exemplifies this war of self-interpretation. Nazi German race generalizations were imposed upon the Anglo-Saxons, while Anglo-Saxon individualism was imposed upon the Germans. Of course, we should not forget the exceptions to these generalizations. The Anglo-Saxons imposed the mold of the Norman master race stereotype upon the Nazi Germans. The entire liberal democratic system of individualism is designed to oppose anyone who fits the conqueror master race stereotype, while the Nazi Germans were sensitive to any individual pro-Nazi racist Anglo-Saxons who were exceptions to the individualistic rule. Anglo-individualism is socio-biologically relative, whereas Germanic ethnic identity preserved its public and political character. The suppressed Anglo-Saxon ethnic identity became privatized and individualized, whereas German nationalism individuated their nation against all other. Anglo-Saxon nationalism individuated its members against the enemies of modernity. Yet in trying to account for every exception to every group generalization, Westerners are projecting their own identity crisis upon. In contrast to the Germans, Anglo-Saxon ethnocentrism itself made coherent, self-consistent race thinking or socio-biological generalizing inherently problematic. To be self-consistent, Anglo-Saxon had to account, allow, and accept the right of the exception to the general socio-biological rule. An individualistic valuation of exceptions conflicts with the straightforward ability to make U9H level less deep generalizations built from a string of other. The formal Anglo-Saxon prejudice against socio-biological generalizations stems from a peculiar kind of ethnocentrism. Living with the consequences of the dramatic event of 1066 was inescapable for all but a few exiles. Escape from the conquest could be achieved only through psychosocial repression. Escape from the past and escape from the hereditarily bound association of Anglo-Saxon and class inferiority could originally be achieved only with a psychosocial disassociation. From this stems a kind of unconscious, historical dissociative disorder built into the very anti-past conception of modernity. Individualism and its low-key disassociation of the social and biological are practical expressions of this dissociative disorder. Racial probabilities were jettisoned in favor of individualistic possibilities. The convergence of father and land associations that lead to the Nazi-like socio-biological syntheses were legitimated, while the analytic low-key disassociation of the social and biological was legitimated. Conquest originally meant that the Anglo-Saxon men were collectively forced into the role of drag queens. They were men forced into a domestic, sub-political gender role. Just as individualism freed Anglo-Saxon men from that collective feminine caste role, feminism among women was only the flip side of this equalization. The entire logic of Anglo-American liberal individualism begins with this effort to confound and rebel against that ordered, fixed convergence of race and class and elevate those who defy its categories and classifications. The new logic of socio-biological chaos was to accept every generalization, break every social categorical rule, and refute every stereotype. Freedom is the freedom to be different, for otherwise it is indistinguishable from obedience and conformity. The logic of disorder is the product of this new order. Individualism is the exception as the rule. This was organized and initiated, of course, by that rather influential minority who refuted the great Norman generalization that the Anglo-Saxon are an inferior race who are by nature incapable of ruling themselves. The American founders were the exceptions who wrote these new rules, just as John Adams was the exception to rule of the politically inferior Anglo-Saxon slave owner. George Washington was the exception to the rule of the Norman tyrant. The founding father president was not only the exception as the rule, but the rule of the exceptions. The exceptional logic of this new mode of modern morality is to be self-consistent, to not be a hypocrite. Nonetheless, one can say that individualism, universalized as human rights, is an overgeneralization rooted in Anglo-Saxon ethnocentrism. But then again, The example of George Washington shows how this, too, is partly an overgeneralization as well. The premise of individualism became identified with modern rationality because the alternatives become utterly incoherent and riddled with contradictions. While the Norman conquerors formed the basis for the English upper class, in every dimension of race, class, culture, etc., there are significant exceptions to every generalization. Which identity was to take precedence? Class. The nation as a whole. Anglo-Saxon identity was largely reduced to a partial non-upper class identity, which could sometimes identify with the king or queen and sometimes even identify with the Norman-based aristocracy. The persistence of the English class system is the historical testament to the failure of England to ever achieve the sense of racial unity that culminated in Nazism. For the Germans, government, according to Hobbes and Locke, is artificial, not natural. Ultimately, this ambivalence or indeterminacy, flickering between alternate social identities, made a third alternative, individualism, gradually more stable and rational than either. The problems of conflicting, incoherent identities were bypassed altogether with an individual identity. Somehow, in the reduction to individuals, the Anglo-Saxon got partially lost in the process. Every individual is contingent on the clean slate idea insofar as one is freed from the bonds of heredity. The alternative is to dig in the deep and tangled thickets of biological history. The individual provided the means of the tabula, a means of erasing the scrambled contradictions of an insoluble past. The individual premise has an abstract Cartesian simplicity and internal coherence that masks its external incoherence with the complexities of the empirical world. This terrible simplifier of the individual brought order out of the chaos of Anglo-Saxon/Norman identity entropy while disseminating and generalizing this ethnic entropy as America. Who, then, are the people? America is a continuation of ethnic identity confusion and racial disintegration that began with the Norman conquest. The ambivalent instability of American ethnic identity has its rock-solid foundation in the clash of Anglo-Saxon and Norman. The problem of conflicting internal identities after the Norman conquest was not solved but inherited by the solution of Western individualism. Is a Chinese American, for example, an American first, or would it be more accurate to call this individual an American? Chinese multiculturalism has clarified this original problem by legitimizing the latter interpretation. The problems of England's lack of internal ethnic unity were reformulated and reinvented but not universally solved by the United States.